The history of education started around the pre-1800s, or also known as the colonial times. The main reason for education during this time was driven by religious purposes. The goal was for children to be educated on the Bible so that they may withstand temptation. Cotton Mather, a minister and one of the proponents of education during this time, wrote an address titled "The Education of Children" to show this need. During the colonial period, there were no textbooks, so children were taught using such instruments such as a horn book, a primer, and the Bible. A horn book was a wooden paddle with lessons tacked on and covered by a piece of transparent horn. Boys were also taught differently from girls. Also, education was driven by social class. Dame schools and district schools also became a part of education during this time frame. The dame school was what we might call today an informal daycare center. It involved parents leaving their children with a neighborhood lady, or a dame, as they were called, who would teach the children their letters, ABCs, numbers, and prayers while she went about her daily household tasks. Also, district schools in the latter part of the colonial years, the New England colonies established this district school for the purpose of expanding education to more people. The schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. There was minimal female participation, no minority participation, and there was rigid discipline. As time progressed, education was seeing small strides. Religion was still important, but there was a shift in focus. It was not until the 1840s that an organized education system existed. This was called the Common School Movement. Education reformers like Horace Mann and Henry Barnard, working in Massachusetts and Connecticut, started these common school systems. Common school advocates worked to establish a free elementary education accessible to everyone and financed by public funds. As such, they advocated for public schools that they should be accountable to local school boards and state governments. In 1833, Reverend William Holmes McGuffey was approached and was asked to write a school textbook called the McGuffey Reader. This reader was known as an eclectic reader, meaning that the selections were chosen from a number of sources and were considered remarkably literary works and probably exerted a greater influence upon literary taste in the United States more than any other book. Progressing through education, public high schools were developed in the early 1800s as a public education alternative to the private academies of the 18th century. The schools focused on practical curriculum with college preparatory classes. In 1874, the Kalamazoo case fought to establish taxes for the support of public high schools. Then, in 1862 and 1890, Thomas Morrell founded the First and Second Morrell Acts. These acts were to donate proceeds of public land to support colleges. Around 1876, the Jim Crow laws legally segregated schools. Around 1880, the Tuskegee Normal School, which later became the Tuskegee Institute, was built by a student, Lewis Adams, who was a former slave and successive tradesman. He made a deal to deliver African American voters in the 1880 election. In return, the Alabama legislature passed a bill to establish a normal school for colored teachers at Tuskegee. He insisted on having an African American principal, and Booker T. Washington was hired. In 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark United States Supreme Court decision that established a separate but equal law. There were some early educators also during the 1800s. One of these was Catherine Beecher. By 1824, she was convinced that her mission was to find happiness in living to do good. That year, she opened a private school for young ladies in Hartford, Connecticut, known as the Hartford Female Seminary, which taught the higher branches of learning. In 1831, a school teacher who was raised as a Quaker, Prudence Crandall, stirred controversy with her education of African American girls in Canterbury, Connecticut. Her private school, which opened in 1831, was boycotted when she admitted a 17-year-old African American girl. And lastly, during this time period, Mary Lyon, in 1837, opened up one of the first female seminaries called Mount Holyoke. This was the first college for women. Part of Lyon's mission was to offer a more challenging curriculum that many other women's schools did at this time. She required that each student took math and science courses.
The 1900s opened with some amazing features like the first flight by the Wright brothers, Henry Ford's first Model T, and Einstein's theory of relativity. It also had hardships like the Boxer Rebellion and the San Francisco earthquake. The 1900s also saw the introduction of the first silent movie and teddy bears. Plus, don't miss out on discovering more about the mysterious explosion in Siberia. There were two sides to the 20th century. On one hand, there were several recessions. There were also two terrible world wars, and on the other hand, there was a vast importance in striving for the standards of life of ordinary people. Life expectancy also rose even during the Depression of the 1830s. Over 15 million children are enrolled in American public schools. Between 1891 and 1900, 3,700,000 new immigrants arrived in America. 33 states and the District of Columbia have compulsory education laws heightening the issues of language instruction. At least 600,000 elementary students receive some part of their education in German. The majority of students in urban centers are children of immigrants. Schools are called upon to prepare these students for jobs in the new urban industry. In 1904, Mary McLeod Bethune, an African-American educator, founds the Daytona Educational and Industrial Training School for Negro girls in Daytona Beach, Florida. The school merges with the Cookman Institute in 1923 and becomes a co-educational high school, which eventually evolves into Bethune-Cookman College and now is referred to as Bethune-Cookman University. In 1917, the United States enters World War I, spurring a wave of language restrictions in schools. Many states question the loyalty of non-English speakers, interact with English-only instruction. Most public school systems contain the study of German, mob Rad School, and burned German textbooks. Anti-German sentiment quickly turns to hostility towards all minority tones. By the mid-1920s, bilingual education is dismantled throughout the country. The federal government passes the Smith-Hughes Act, allocating money for agricultural, trade, industrial, and home economic education for students over 14 who are prepared for trade careers. The legislation is groundbreaking, creating a teaching and administering vocational education on a mass scale. In 1925, Tennessee versus John Scopes, or better yet known as the Monkey Trial, captures national attention as John Scope, a high school biology teacher, is charged with a heinous crime of teaching evolution. The trial ends in Scope's conviction. The evolution versus creatism controversy is also an issue in today's society. In the 1926, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, better yet known as the SATs, is first administered. In 1932, the Association for the Advancement of Progressive Education conducts a famous 8-year study in which students in an experimental program are compared with peers in a traditional program. The study finds that progressive students attain better grades, more honors, have higher intellectual drive and curiosity, and participates in more student group activities. In 1945, Dr. Charles Prosser conducts a study in which he finds 20% of students capable of college work, 20% best served by vocational training, and the remaining 60% in need of practical training for everyday life. His findings inspire educators to launch the Life Adjustment Movement in an effort to make school more relevant for students. Students receive guidance and training in citizenship, home and family life, use of leisure, health, tools of learning, work experience, and occupational adjustment. 29 states made curriculum changes as a result of the Life Adjustment Movement. In 1948, in the case of McComb versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court rules that schools cannot allow release time during the school day, which allows students to participate in religious education in their public school classroom. In 1954, on May 17, the U.S. Supreme Court announces its decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, ruling that separate education facilities are inherently unequal, thus overturning its previous ruling in the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Brown versus Board of Education is actually a combination of 5 cases from different parts of the country. It is a historic first step in a long and still unfinished journey towards equality in the United States education system. In 1955, Rosa Parks, a Montgomery, Alabama seamstress, refuses to give up her seat on a bus to a Caucasian passenger and is arrested and fined. A year later, in the case of Broder v. Gale, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that segregated seating on buses is unconstitutional. In 1959, the ACT test is first administered. In 1960, first grader Rudy Bridges is the first African American to attend William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. She becomes a class of one as parents remove all Caucasian students from the school. In 1962, in the case of Engel v. Ventel, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that the state of New York violates the First Amendment. The ruling specifies that state officials may not compose an official state prayer and requires that it be recited in the public schools of the state at the beginning of each day. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act becomes a law. The Section 504 of the Act guarantees civil rights for people with disabilities in the context of federally funded institutions and requires accommodation in schools, including participation in programs and activities, as well as access to buildings. Today, the 504 plan are used to provide accommodations for students with disabilities who do not qualify for special education or an IEP. In 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act becomes a federal law. It requires that a free, appropriate public education suited to the student's individual needs and offered in the least restrictive setting be provided for all handicapped children. States are given until 1978 to fully implement this law. In 1982, in the case of Plyer v. Doe, the U.S. Supreme Court rules in a 5-4 decision that Texas law denying access to public education for undocumented school-aged children violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The ruling also found that school districts cannot charge tuition fees for the education of these children. In 1989, the University of Phoenix establishes their first online campus, the first to offer an online bachelor's and master's degree. It becomes the largest private university of North America. In 1990 through 91, the Wisconsin legislature passes the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, the first voucher legislation that allows students to attend private, non-religious schools at taxpayers' expense. The program originally allowed up to 1% of economically disadvantaged pupils in the Milwaukee public schools to use the state share of education funds as full payment of tuition in participating private schools. On April 20th, 1999, 2 Columbine High School students go on a killing spree that leaves 15 dead and 23 wounded at the Littleton, Colorado school, making it the nation's deadliest school shooting incident. Though schools tightened safety procedures as a result of the Columbine massacre, school shootings occur at an alarming rate.
In 2001, George W. Bush proposed a bill called No Child Left Behind, which was a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This bill is for any school that uses federal funding. The bill says that schools should use standardized tests to measure the progress of the students within the schools. This bill was signed on January 8, 2002. In 2003, the North American Council for Online Learning became an official corporate entity. This nonprofit organization was committed to providing and enhancing kindergarten through 12th grade online learning. The Individual with Disability Improvement Act, also known as IDEA, was reauthorized in 2004 and signed into effect on July 1, 2005 by President George Bush. Changes were made to the IEP process and conduct safeguard. The bill also required each district to use the response to intervention as a means of screening for early identification of potential students that may have a learning disability. In January of 2007, the American Association of Mental Retardation was renamed American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. They changed their name to join the trend of replacing the phrase mental retardation with the term intellectual disability. In 2009, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act of 2009 provided billions of dollars for schools to help prevent layoffs, provide an increase to teacher salaries, provide a way for schools to make needed updates and modernization of classrooms, and to help provide a way for analyzing students' performances. As part of the Recovery Act of 2009, on July 24th, the race to the top began. This was an incentive for schools to increase standardized test scores. Each state is given points on how well they do in specific areas. Then, the state with the most points will be awarded money for being at the top. In 2009, the Common Core state standards were officially launched, and it was expected that many of the states will adopt these principles. This curriculum was created to provide students with knowledge and information that will better prepare them for entering into the workforce or into higher education. In the State of the Union address on January 24, 2012, President Barack Obama has encouraged states to require students to stay in school until age 18 or until they graduate from high school. On December 14, 2012, in Newtown, Connecticut, 20 children and 6 adults were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School. This is one of the deadliest shootings by a single person recorded in U.S. history. With the recession taking place in the United States, the largest mass of school closings in U.S. history took place in Chicago when they decided to close 50 schools in the area in 2013. Before school started for the 2013-2014 school year, the Chicago School District estimated almost 2,800 employees were expected to be laid off. Over 1,800 of them were teachers. The Philadelphia School District had planned to cut nearly 4,000 employees before the school year began, and over 650 employees were teachers. Starting the 2013 school year, 20 teachers and staff in Clarksville, Arkansas will be carrying handguns when schools open. Currently, the Common Core curriculum is almost accepted by every state nationwide. Since the Common Core is not federally mandated, there are some states that have not decided whether they will use the curriculum, and some states that have decided to use it are slow to implement the curriculum in the classroom. For the states that have decided to adapt Common Core, changes will continue to be made in school districts, curriculum, classrooms, and standardized assessment tests in order to meet the requirements that are set by the state education department. With school shootings in 1999 at Columbine High School in Colorado, in 2007 at Virginia Tech University, in 2008 at Northern Illinois University, and most currently in 2012 at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut, parents and teachers continue to ask how safe are the public schools. Currently, schools and the government are trying to find ways to make schools safer for the student. While federal government continues to cut spending on education, schools continue to close, teachers will continue to lose their jobs, school programs will continue to be shut down, and resources for the school will continue to diminish. While some teachers are losing their jobs, other teachers are gaining more students than they can handle. Teachers and parents are trying to show that the students' education will suffer in the coming years if budget cuts continue. Since the IDEA Act was put into place in 1975, each student has the ability to be taught in a least restrictive environment. This may allow students with disabilities to participate and to be involved in the general education classroom. While some parents and teachers express their concern over this issue, other parents believe that their student has a right to be in the mainstream classroom. Although there are pros and cons to both issues, this is a tough issue that will continue to be debated over the years. Since the case of Engel v. Vitale in 1962 regarding prayer in school, Prayer and religion is still a controversial and debated issue going on in schools today. Depending on the school district, many of them over the years have banned prayer in school and have set guidelines of what can and can't be done in schools. Over the next couple years, lawsuits will continue to happen over what is appropriate for teachers and students to do in regards to religion and education. As we have looked over time and the influences that has been made in education, we need to keep in mind that what's done today may affect what is done tomorrow.